Okay, please prepare your notes. Okay, I hope you already open your notes so that you can write down and you do not miss what I'm saying. Okay, do you can see this note? Can you see this note?
Yes.
Okay, you already learned how to construct these three type of statement, which is converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Right now, we're gonna determine the truth value. Okay, now this is the table of how to determine the truth value of converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Okay, if you only remember this table without understanding the meaning of this table is useless. Okay, you need to understand what is the meaning of this table. Okay, how this table is constructed. Okay, first there are two rules to determine the truth value of implication. For the first rule is, if the antecedent is true, the implication is only true if the consequent is true. Okay, we know that the form of implication is if P then Q. We know that P is antecedent. Okay, we already learned about implication and what is antecedent and what is consequent. Okay, this is the form of implication. If P then Q. We already know how to determine the antecedent and the consequent. Okay, if P is the antecedent, then Q is the consequent. Okay, the implication will be true if the antecedent is true, and also the consequent is true. Okay, I change my color. Okay, if antecedent is true, then the consequent also need to be true for this whole implication true. Okay, now for the rule number 2, if antecedent is false, the implication is always true. Okay, I will write the implication. If P then Q. Which one is the antecedent and which one is the consequent? Okay, if P then Q, which one is the antecedent and which one is the consequent? Hello? Anybody there? Hello? Can you respond?
P.
Which one is the antecedent? P or Q?
P is P.
Okay, P. This one is antecedent. Okay, and this one is consequent. I already show you this example above here. Okay, this is the consequent. And then what's rule number 2 mean about? If the antecedent is false, then the implication is always true. If P is false, okay, if this false, if the antecedent is false, and that means this whole implication will be true. Okay, if rule number 1, if antecedent is true, okay, if this antecedent is true, the consequent also needs to be true for this whole implication to be true. Okay, this is the rule for the truth of implication. Now we take a look for one by one for converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Okay, this is for implication. Okay, first we're gonna look for implication. If P then Q, this is the form of implication. And we know that this implication, P is the antecedent, Q is the consequent. Okay, from the rule just now, okay, rule 1, the implication is, if the implication true, the antecedent, for rule 1, the antecedent needs to be true and the consequent also needs to be true for the whole implication to be true. Okay, if we look this table, this one, if P is true and Q is true, then the implication also true. How about if Q is false? Okay, if Q is false, then the whole implication will be false. Okay, how about if P is false, if the antecedent is false, Q is true, then the implication will be true. Which rule is this? Rule number 1 or rule number 2? Is this rule number 1 or rule number 2?
Rule number
This one.
number 1, teacher.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Now we continue. Okay. Sorry for the internet problem. You know how hard it is, online class, right? Okay. Just now I'm asking if the antecedent is false. Okay, if the antecedent is false, then consequent is true. Then the whole implication is true. Which rule is this? This is rule 1 or rule number 2? Is this rule 1 or rule number 2?
Number 2.
Correct. This is rule number 2. Okay, rule number 2 say that if antecedent is false, then the whole implication is true. Okay, that is the difference between rule number 1 and rule number 2. Okay, for this up here, okay, if the antecedent is true, this is application of rule number 1. Okay, if antecedent is true, then the consequent also needs to be true for the whole implication to be true. Okay, this is for implication. Now we take a look for converse. Okay, this is a form of the converse statement. Okay, this one. If Q, then P. It is the reverse from the implication. And then from this converse, we can determine that Q is the antecedent and P is the consequent. Okay, it's the reverse. Okay, reverse. Now for the converse, Q is the antecedent, P is the consequent. If implication just now, P is the antecedent and Q is the consequent, but the converse is the reverse from the implication. Now we take a look for one by one. If the Q is true, okay, Q is antecedent, okay, this is antecedent, okay, and then this is consequent. Okay, now if the antecedent is true, if Q is true, and then P is true, then the converse will be true. Okay, if the antecedent is true, then the consequent, the P is false, then the whole implication will be false. Okay, what rule is this? Is this rule number 1 or rule number 2? Is this rule number 1 or rule number 2?
Can you repeat the question, teacher?
Okay, from this first row, if the antecedent is true, then the consequent is true, the whole implication is true. Okay, is this rule number 1 or rule number 2?
Number 1.
Correct, this is rule number 1. So the below here, the second row is if the antecedent is false. Okay, this is apply of the rule number 2. Okay, then the whole converse will be true. Okay, do you understand what I am trying to say until now? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
Yes. Andre?
50-50 maybe. We need to do exercise first.
Yes, you need to do exercise for you to understand. Okay, we continue.
Okay, teacher.
Okay, thank you. Now we continue for the inverse. Okay, the negation of P is the antecedent and the negation of Q is the consequent. Okay, here we can see that this table is negation P. Okay, if P is true, then the negation of P will be false. Okay, it's the opposite meaning. And then if Q is true, and the negation of Q will be false. Okay, here. Okay, the one that's involved in inverse is only here. Okay, this one and this one only. Okay, now we take a look for if the negation of P is false. Okay, which we know that negation of P is the antecedent. Then if the antecedent is false, then the whole inverse will be true. Okay, even though if the consequence is false or true, okay, it still will be true. Okay, now we take a look if the negation of P is true, then we take a look for negation Q is false, then this whole inverse will be false because the negation of Q, the consequent, is false. And then if we take a look for the negation of Q is true, then this will be true. Okay, this is rule number 1. Okay, above here is rule number 2. Now we take a look for the contrapositive. Okay, it just the same as the inverse, but the difference is antecedent and the consequent. If the contrapositive, the negation of Q will become antecedent and negation of P will become consequent. Now we take a look at this row only and this only. Okay, if negation of Q is false, that means that the antecedent is false, then the contrapositive will be true. This is the application of rule number 2. Okay, now we take a look for the second condition. If the negation of Q, which is the antecedent, is true, then the consequent also need to be true, which is when we take a look for the negation of P is true, then the whole contra positive will be true. If the consequent negation of P is false, this one, then the contra positive will be false also. Now we take a look for the example. This is the example. Okay, you already done this before. You already determined the converse, the inverse, and contra positive. Now we take a look one by one how to determine the truth value of each of these following. Okay, from the implication, we know that the implication was in this form: if P, then Q. P is the antecedent, Q is the consequent. Okay, from this statement, 0.5 kilogram equal to 500 gram is the antecedent. Okay, P. Then 1/2 kilogram is the equal to 500 gram is the consequent, which is Q. Okay. Now we take a look one by one. First, we determine the true value for the consequent antecedent. Okay, 0.5 kilogram into equal to 500 gram. Is this true or false?
True.
Yes, this is true. Then how
True.
about okay, this is also true. Then if both of these true, okay, if the consequent if the antecedent and the consequent true, then this implication also true. Okay, how about converse? Now the converse, the antecedent and the consequent is already changed. Okay, this is the Q. Okay, now above here, okay, this is P. Okay, now for the converse, Q will become antecedent, and P already become consequent. For the implication here, P is antecedent, and for the Q is consequent. Okay, the form of converse is in this form. It is a reverse of the implication. If Q, then P. Okay, now we already determined the truth value of the Q and the P. Q is true, P also true. Then application of rule number 1: if the antecedent is true, then the consequent also needs to be true for the converse to be true. Then this is true. Okay, now we take a look for the inverse. Okay, inverse is in this form: if tilde P, then tilde Q. Okay, this is the inverse. Then we determine which one is tilde P, which one is tilde Q. Okay, 0.5 kilogram is not equal to 500 gram is tilde P. Meanwhile, 1/2 kilogram is not equal to 500 gram is tilde Q. Now tilde P will become antecedent, and for the consequent is tilde Q. Okay, now just now we know that P is true. If it's negation of P, is it true or false? Does tilde P true or false?
Tilde P or P?
Yes?
False.
Okay, false. If P is true, then
Yeah, true.
eh? I'm asking if tilde P, is it true or false? Okay, just now we know that P is true.
It is tilde.
Ah, yes, it's tilde. Tilde P will become false. Okay?
False.
Ah, yes. And then tilde Q also will be false. Because Q just right now, we already know that Q is true. Then the tilde Q will be false. Okay, here is the application of rule number 2. Okay, rule number 2 just said right now is, if the antecedent is false, then the implication will be true. Okay, from here, for the inverse, the antecedent is false. Okay, then the inverse will be true. Okay, this is the difference between the compound statement. Okay, if the compound statement, it has and or. If both of the statement is false, then it is false. But in this situation, which is the implication, for the inverse, if the antecedent is false, then it is still true for the whole implication. Okay? For the contrapositive, what's in this form?
Okay.
Okay. If tilde Q, then tilde P. Okay, from this statement, we will determine which one is tilde Q, which one is tilde P. Okay, 1 per 2 kilogram is not equal to 500 gram. This is tilde Q. 0.5 kilogram is not 500. It's not equal to 500 gram. Okay, this is tilde P. Now, tilde Q will become antecedent. And then tilde P will become consequent. Okay, same with the inverse. Okay, tilde Q, we know tilde Q is false. Okay. Tilde Q just now is, we know that tilde Q is the antecedent. If the antecedent is false, then the whole implication or this contrapositive will be true. Okay, this is the situation if the whole all of this is true. If the implication this implication is true, converse also true, inverse is true, then contrapositive also true. Okay, now we take a look for the second example. Okay, implication was in this form: if P, then Q. Okay, here we can determine that 2 and 8 are even number. Okay, this is P, which is the antecedent. Okay, then the product of 2 and 8 is an odd number. Okay, this is Q. Okay, the consequent for the implication. Okay, implication only. And then we determine the truth value of the antecedent and the consequent. Okay, 2 and 8 are even number. Is it true or false?
True.
Okay, this is true. Okay, and how about the consequent? The product of 2 and 8 is odd number. Is it true or false? Great. This is false. Okay, because 2 plus 2 will become 10. 10 is even number. Okay, this is not odd number. That's why the consequence is false. And then we already determined the antecedent is true and then the consequence is false. Then the application of rule number 1, okay, which is if the antecedent is true, the consequence also needs to be true for the implication to be true. But in this situation, the antecedent is true, meanwhile the consequence is false. Then this implication will be false. Okay. Now we take a look for the converse. Converse was in this form: if Q then P. Okay, this is Q. Okay, then this is P. Okay, for the converse, Q will become antecedent and P will become the consequent. Just right now, we already determined that Q is false. Okay. Q is false. Okay, here is the application of rule number 2. Okay, if the antecedent is false, then the implication will be true. Okay, for this converse, the antecedent is false, then this converse is true. Okay, the converse will be true because the antecedent is false. Okay, do you understand? Do you understand, or do you still confused? Before we continue.
70%.
70%. Okay. Okay, there is just only 2 rules. Okay, first
Yes.
first you only determine which one is the antecedent and which one is the consequent. Okay, then you apply the rule number 1 or rule number 2. Okay, first we take a look for the antecedent. If the antecedent is true, then it is rule number 1. If the antecedent is false, then it is rule number 2. What is rule number 1 say? Rule number 1 says that if antecedent is true, then the consequent needs to be true for the implication to be true. Okay, for the rule number 2 said if the antecedent is false, then the whole implication will be true. Okay, you need to determine step by step. Okay, for the inverse, now we continue for the inverse. It was in this form: if negation, if tilde P, then tilde Q. Okay, in this situation, for the inverse situation, tilde P will become antecedent and tilde Q will become the consequent. Okay, 2 and 8 are not even number. Okay, this is tilde P. The product of 2 and 8 is not an odd number. Okay, this is tilde Q. Okay, just right now we already determined P is true. Okay, how about tilde P? Okay, of course it's the opposite meaning. So if P is true, then tilde P will be false. Okay, just right now we already determined Q is false, then the tilde P will be true. Okay, here, right here, for the inverse, tilde P is the antecedent. If the antecedent is false, and then tilde Q is true, okay, we know that for the inverse, the antecedent is false. Is this whole inverse will be true or false? Which one? Which rule do you apply in this situation?
Rule 2.
Yes. Yes, you apply rule number 2. Because we take a look for the antecedent. The antecedent is false. So, rule number 2 said if the antecedent is false, then the whole implication will be true. So, this inverse will be true. Okay. Okay. Now for the contrapositive. Contrapositive is in this form. If tilde Q, then tilde P. Okay. Now for the contrapositive, tilde Q will become antecedent. Okay. The product of 2 and 8 is not an odd number. Okay, this is tilde Q. 2 and 8 are not even number. Okay, this is tilde P. Okay, tilde Q just now we already determined tilde Q is true, and tilde P is false. Okay, then we know that the antecedent for the contrapositive, which is the tilde Q, is true. Okay, the antecedent is true. Okay, which one, which rules apply in this contrapositive? Is it rule number 1 or rule number 2?
Rule number 1.
Yes, rule number 1. Okay, rule number 1 says that if antecedent is true, then the consequent needs to be true for the whole implication to be true. But in this situation, the consequent, which is tilde P, is false. Okay, the antecedent is true, but the consequent is false. Then this contrapositive will be false. Okay, student. Okay, you can follow, right? Okay, great. Okay, now for the question number 3, let's we do this together. Okay, first, what you do? Okay, first, you need to determine what's the form of the implication. If P, then Q, right? Okay, from this statement, which one is the P and which one is the Q?
Cos 90 degree equal to 1 is P, then sin 90 degree equal to 1 is Q.
Okay, sin 90 degree will become Q. Okay, from this implication, we know that which one is the antecedent and which one is the consequent. Okay, which one is the consequent in which one is the antecedent for this implication, P or Q?
P.
Okay, P will be antecedent and Q will be consequent. Next, we determine the true value of P and Q. Okay, P, is it true or false? Okay, you may press your calculator. Cos 90 degree is equal to, what do you get?
0.
Okay, so if this 0 is not equal to 1, then this P will become false. Where's my pen? Oh, there. Okay, P is false. Okay, is Q true or false?
True.
Okay, true. Okay, now we apply which rule is this? First, we take a look for the antecedent. Does the antecedent true or false? Okay, the antecedent is false. Okay, which rule we apply? Rule number 1 or rule number 2?
Number 2.
Yes, correct. Rule number 2. Okay, if the antecedent is false, then the whole implication will be true. So the implication is true. Correct. And now we take a look for the converse. The converse is in this form. If Q then P. Okay? Sin 90 degree equal to 1. This is Q. Okay? Cos 90 degree equal to 1. Okay, this is P. In this situation, for the converse, Q will become antecedent. P will become consequent. Okay, just now we already determined the truth value for the Q. Q is true. So that means that antecedent is true. If the antecedent is true, which rule is it apply? Rule number 1 or rule number 2?
Number 1.
Correct. Rule number 1. Okay. Rule number 1 says what? Can you explain to me what is rule number 1 say?
If antecedent is true and the consequent is false, then it becomes true.
If the antecedent is true, then the consequent also needs to be true for the whole implication to be true. Antecedent true, consequent true, then the implication will be true. Okay? That is what rule number 1 trying to say. Okay, right now the antecedent is true. Q is true. But the consequent is false. Is it true or false?
False.
Yes, correct. This is false. We apply rule number 1 here. Now, for inverse, what's in this form? If tilde P, then tilde Q. Okay? Cos 90 degree not equal to 1. Okay, this is tilde P. Okay, here since 90 degree not equal to 1 is tilde Q. Okay, tilde P will become antecedent. Then tilde Q will become consequent. Now we take a look for inverse. The antecedent, is it true or false?
True.
Tilde P. Okay, the tilde P or the antecedent will be true. Okay, this is true. Okay, the consequent, is it true or false? Tilde Q?
False.
Okay, great. This is false. Okay. Then we determine which rule we apply, rule number 1 or rule number 2.
One.
Great. So rule number 1. We apply rule number 1 because it is say antecedent is true. So we apply rule number 1. Then we take a look for the consequence. Okay, the consequence says that this inverse is false. So the truth value for inverse is it true or false?
True. Maybe.
Which one? True or false? You apply rule.
True. Because
No, no. Okay, the answer is inverse will be false. Okay, because rule number 1 said the antecedent is true, then the consequent also need to be true for the implication to be true. But here, okay, in this question for the inverse, the antecedent is true, but the consequent is false. Okay, then this will become false. Okay, because the consequent is false. Okay? Okay?
okay, teacher.
Okay.
Okay.
Now we take a look for the contrapositive. Okay, contrapositive. If tilde Q, then tilde P. Okay. Now we determine which one is tilde Q, which one is tilde P. Tilde Q is the sin 90 degree not equal to 1. This is tilde Q. Then cos 90 degree not equal to 1 is tilde P. For the contrapositive, tilde Q will become antecedent. Okay. Meanwhile, tilde P will become consequent. Just now, we already determined the truth value for the tilde Q and tilde P. Tilde Q you say false, okay? Then for the contrapositive, the antecedent will become false. And then tilde P is true. So the consequent true. Now, we determine which rule we apply. Rule number 1 or rule number 2. We take a look for the antecedent.
Rule 2.
Yes, rule 2. What rule number 2 say? Can you explain to me?
If antecedent is false,
Okay.
then the consequent is true, then it becomes false.
No,
I don't know.
the
Because I haven't print yet.
Oh, you
Sorry,
haven't print
teacher.
yet. Never mind. It's okay. It's okay. Okay. You need to understand between the rule number 1 and rule number 2. Okay. Okay. The antecedent here is false. Okay. The consequent is true. If the antecedent is false, so the application of rule number 2. Rule number 2 said that if the antecedent is false, then the whole implication will be true. Okay, from here we can determine the antecedent is false. Okay, So this contrapositive will become true. We apply the rule number 2 here. I think you need to understand better about the rule. Okay, I show you again about the rule. Okay, here, this one here. To determine the truth value, there is 2 rules. Rule number 1 and rule number 2. Okay, we know that in implication, it has antecedent and consequent. You need to take a look for both of these, 2 of these, antecedent and the consequent. Rule number 1 said that if the antecedent is true, okay, if the antecedent is true, the consequent needs to be true for the implication to be true. Okay, if P then Q. Okay, this is the implication. Okay, like here, I already show you here. Okay, this is the implication. P, we know P is the antecedent. Okay, right here, P is the antecedent, Q is the consequent. Rule number 1 says if the antecedent is true, okay, true, then the consequent need to be true for this whole implication to be true. Okay, this is implication. Okay, if P then Q, this is implication. If antecedent and consequent is true, then this is true. Okay, if the consequent is false, okay, if it is false, then the implication will be false. Okay, do you understand?
Yes.
Okay,
How about rule number 2, teacher?
Okay, rule number 2.
If antecedent is false, consequent is false.
Okay, rule number 2, we only need to see the antecedent. Okay, antecedent is false, then the implication automatically will become true, even though the consequent is true or false. It will be automatically true. Okay, rule number 2 is easy. If the antecedent is false, then the implication always true, no matter if the consequent is true or false. Okay, it is still true. That is the difference between rule number 1 and rule number 2. Okay, do you understand? Do you get it?
Yes. Now I get it.
Yes, now you get it. Okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay, if you have any confused, okay, just say it to me. Just say it directly right now. Okay, so that I can explain to you. Now we do the question number 4. Okay, question number 4. This is your homework for yesterday. Okay, for the converse. First we look for the implication. If P, then Q. Okay, for the converse is if Q, then P. Inverse, if tilde P, then tilde Q. Okay, for the contrapositive is if tilde Q, then tilde P. Okay, now we determine we construct the converse, inverse, and contrapositive for this question number 4. What is the converse for this one? Can someone say out the answer? I will write down.
If 5 minus 2 is equal to 2, then 2 plus 2 is equal to 5.
Okay, good. Okay, how about the inverse? How about the inverse?
If 2 plus 2 is not equal to 5,
It's not
then
equal to
5 minus 2 is not equal to 2.
Okay, great. Then 5 minus 2 is not equal to 2. Okay. For the contrapositive,
If 5 minus 2 is not equal to 2, then 2 plus 2 is not equal to 5.
great. Good. Okay. Now you already construct all the converse, inverse, and the contrapositive. Then we determine which one is P and which one is Q. Okay. From this implication, 2 plus 2 is P. And 5 minus 2 is Q. Okay, in this situation, for the implication, P will become antecedent or consequent. Which one?
Antecedent.
Great. Will become antecedent. Okay, Q will become consequent. Okay, now we determine the truth value for the P and Q. Okay, we take a look for the P. P is 2 plus 2 equal to 5. Is this true or false?
False.
Okay, this is false. Then for the Q, is this true or false?
False also.
Okay, false also. Great. Okay, before we proceed, I will write rule number 1 and rule number 2 up here. Rule 1 said that if antecedent true, okay, consequent also need to be true for the implication to be true. Okay, meanwhile rule number 2 said, change my color. Okay, rule number 2 said that if antecedent false, then the implication will be automatically true. Okay, now for this question number 4, we know that P is false, the antecedent is false. Then which rule we apply? Rule number 1 or rule number 2?
Rule 2.
Yes, rule 2. So what is the truth value for this implication? True or false?
True.
Yes, correct.
True, true.
True. Okay, now you already understand. Okay. Now for the converse, 5 minus 2 is Q. Now Q will become antecedent. Okay, P will become consequent. Okay, now we already know that Q is false. Is it correct? Q is false.
Yes.
Then, which rule we apply? Rule number 2 or rule number 1?
Rule number 2.
Correct. Rule number 2. Because we just take a look for the antecedent. If the antecedent is false, okay, rule number say the antecedent is false. So, the converse, is it true or false?
True. Eh?
Okay. It will become true. Okay. True.
So confusing.
Right. This is so confusing. It's okay. Tomorrow we will do revision about this true value, because I know this is very hard. That's why I will teach you again this tomorrow. And then inverse. Okay, inverse. If tilde p is this one. 2 plus 2 not equal to 5. This is tilde p. Then 5 minus 2 not equal to 2. Okay, this is tilde q. Is it correct?
Both become true.
Right, both will become true. Okay, right now my question is, which one is the antecedent?
Tilde p.
Yes, tilde p will become antecedent in this situation. Okay, for the inverse, tilde p will become antecedent. Now you said that tilde p is true, so that means the antecedent is true. So, which rule we apply? Rule number 1 or rule number 2?
Rule number 1.
Yes, rule number 1. Rule number 1 said that if antecedent is true, consequent also needs to be true for the implication to be true. Okay? In this inverse, antecedent is true, consequent also be true, then inverse also true or false? Yes? True or false?
True.
Yes, this will become true. Okay, now for the contrapositive, can you do it by yourself? What is the answer? Can you tell me? Is it true or false, the contrapositive?
True.
Great, this is true. Which rule you play? Rule number 1 or rule number 2?
Rule number.
Yes? 1 or 2?
1.
Correct. We apply rule number 1. Okay. Okay, this is question number 5. I need you to do this question by yourself as your homework. Okay, this is your homework. Question number 5. I want to discuss all the question with you, but it already past noon 12. Okay. So the comprehensive exercise also you need to do this exercise. Okay, this is your homework. Question number 5 is your homework, and comprehensive exercise also your homework. Okay, you need to complete all this homework today, and we will discuss this tomorrow. Okay, is it okay?
Yes.
Teacher, can
Yes.
you show again question 4? Oh no,
For what?
I want to screenshot.
Oh, you want to screenshot? Okay. Which one? Question number what?
4, yes, this one.
This is 3.
Question 4 only.
Question 4. Okay.
Okay, done. Thank you, teacher.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay. Anybody else? Do you have any question?
No.
Okay, no.
Okay.
Okay.
For me lah. Don't know the others.
Okay. For today, homework. Okay, I just said right now is question number 5, and you will do the comprehensive exercise. Okay, you need to be complete before tomorrow class. Okay. Okay, that's all for today. That's all for the class today. I'm sorry for we end. It's very late 10 minutes, and now you can end here. And thank you for your cooperation today. Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
Assalamualaikum.
Thank you, teacher. Bye bye.
Thank you, teacher.
Bye. Bye lah.